Human prehistory isn't a triumphant march of progress. It's a desperate, unhinged comedy of errors where our ancestors spent 99% of their time hiding in the dark, hyperventilating, and stealing trash from animals that could snap them in half. Now, grab your crudely sharpened rocks, look out for giant predators, and let's open the prehistoric case file. Let's talk about the greatest intellectual property theft of the Pleistocene epoch. A cold case of absolute, unfiltered plagiarism that somehow made its way into national museums, history textbooks, and the hearts of overly optimistic anthropologists worldwide. Picture the crime scene. It is 1995. A team of researchers is digging through the dirt floors of Divje Babe, a damp, deeply uninviting cave system nestled in the mountains of Slovenia. They are sifting through a sediment layer dating back roughly 43,000 years, right in the miserable heart of the Middle Paleolithic. And there, sitting amongst the usual depressing garbage dump of shattered rocks, chunks of charcoal, and prehistoric dread, they find it. A fragment of a juvenile cave bear femur featuring two conspicuously circular holes punched straight through the bone shaft. Almost immediately, the human evolutionary PR machine kicks into high gear. You have to understand, for over a century, Neanderthals had suffered from a chronically terrible brand image. They were widely dismissed by modern humans as lumbering, brainless meat tanks whose entire cultural portfolio consisted of hitting things with sticks and subsequently freezing to death in the snow. But this bone? This mangled femur was a rebranding opportunity of epic proportions. The academic community looked at those two little holes and decided, with absolutely zero hesitation, that this was a flute. The Divje Babe flute, the oldest confirmed musical instrument in the history of the world. Overnight, the narrative flipped. Suddenly, the Neanderthal wasn't just a glorified cave squatter running an unpaid internship in sheer survival. He was a misunderstood indie artist. A Paleolithic thought leader dropping the absolute hottest acoustic mixtape of the Ice Age. Museums fast-tracked exhibits. Documentaries were lavishly produced with dramatic voiceovers. People literally constructed modern replicas of this exact bone fragment, hopped into recording studios, and played haunting, breathy jazz solos just to prove how cultured and soulful our heavy-browed cousins truly were. We painted this beautiful, Disney-level diorama of a lone Neanderthal, sitting cross-legged by a crackling fire, watching the encroaching glaciers, and channeling his profound existential trauma into a sick pentatonic riff. It was the ultimate historical glow-up. But let's act like actual forensics investigators for a second and look at the situational data, because the math here is deeply, hilariously suspicious. When we look at the reality of Ice Age Europe, we realize nobody was sitting around composing symphonies. The Pleistocene was essentially an unending hostile takeover by nature, a waking nightmare where everything with a pulse was heavily armored and actively trying to murder you. Neanderthals were not participating in a thriving, bohemian gig economy of arts and crafts. They were participating in the ultimate scavenger hustle. You generally do not invent complex woodwind instruments when you are suffering from chronic seasonal malnutrition and hiding in a rock crevice from felines the size of modern minivans. The very idea that a desperate hominid looked at a massive, terrifying cave bear, a 600-kilogram beast that could casually decapitate you with a single, lazy swipe of its paw, and thought, you know what I should do with that guy's leg? I should definitely make a soprano recorder out of it, is staggeringly arrogant. It implies a level of chill, detached leisure time that simply did not exist for a species that spent most of its life expectancy running away from things. Yet, modern humans bought the Neanderthal Jazz Club narrative hook, line, and sinker. Why? Because we desperately need to believe that we have always been special, profound, and deeply creative. We want to believe that even in the darkest, coldest, most aggressively miserable eras of history, the human spirit soared through the magic of music. We eagerly gave our ancestors all the credit in the world for taking a piece of skeletal debris and turning it into a prehistoric Spotify playlist. We slapped our patent on it and called it human ingenuity. We claimed the copyright, but we never bothered to ask the most important question at the crime scene. Who actually put those holes in that bone? Because if you look closely at that celebrated artifact, the story it tells isn't one of profound musical genius. It is a story of stolen valor. It's a story where we walked into a cave, found someone else's chewed-up garbage, and confidently convinced the modern world we invented jazz. To understand how this prehistoric rebranding campaign completely fell apart, we have to introduce the ultimate buzzkills of the archaeological community, taphonomists. Taphonomy is essentially the forensic accounting of the natural world. It is the deeply unglamorous science of figuring out exactly how a biological organism turned into a miserable, fragmented fossil over thousands of years. It studies the decay, the crushing, the weathering, and yes, the fossilized feces, otherwise known as coprolites, left behind at a site. When taphonomists finally got their hands on the Divje babe flute, they didn't bring pitch pipes or music theory degrees. They brought 3D surface scanners, bite-mark databases, and a massive dose of reality. And what they found completely ruined the Neanderthal acoustic coffeehouse vibe. To reconstruct the actual events that took place 43,000 years ago, we have to look at the primary suspects in the Ice Age European theater. Forget the majestic mammoths and the noble saber-toothed cats. The real, terrifying mid-level management of Pleistocene Europe was the cave hyena. These things were absolute units. They weighed significantly more than modern spotted hyenas and possessed jaw muscles that functioned like biological hydraulic presses. Their entire evolutionary business model was built on finding things that were already dead, crushing their skeletons into dust, and digesting the calcium. The cave hyena was the ultimate unapologetic opportunist. It didn't care about abstract art, it didn't care about hominid culture, and it certainly didn't care about composing a sick melody to express its feelings about the encroaching glaciers. It cared about bone marrow. Bone marrow was the high-calorie avocado toast of the Pleistocene. It was dense, incredibly nutritious, and locked away inside thick skeletal vaults that only a creature with an extreme underbite and zero social graces could crack open. So, let's look at the crime scene data and reconstruct the actual, highly embarrassing series of events. We are back in Divje Babe Cave. A juvenile cave bear has died. Maybe it froze to death, maybe it starved, or maybe it got aggressively evicted from its own living room by a gang of freezing hominids who desperately needed a co-living space and committed a clumsy assassination while the bear was hibernating. Regardless of how the bear expired, the meat has been stripped away. Enter our primary suspect, a massively overgrown, incredibly bored cave hyena looking for a quick snack in the dark. The hyena finds the leftover leg bone of the juvenile bear. Now, because the bear was a subadult, its bones had not fully calcified into solid, unbreakable rock just yet. The femur was still slightly spongy, relatively speaking. The hyena grabs the bone in its mouth, right across the middle of the shaft, and applies a casual few thousand pounds of crushing force with its premolars. It fully expects the bone to violently splinter so it can slurp up that sweet, calorie-dense marrow. But here is where the comedic timing of physics and biomechanics comes into play. The bone does not shatter. Instead, the hyena's massive, cone-shaped teeth punch cleanly through the softer cortical bone, creating two roughly circular, evenly spaced punctures on one side and corresponding massive damage on the opposite side where the lower jaw clamped down. It is the Pleistocene equivalent of aggressively biting into a jawbreaker candy and just chipping your teeth instead of getting to the center. The hyena tries again. It gnaws heavily on both ends of the bone, which, by the way, forensic analysts confirm are completely chewed up and missing their spongy articular ends, an absolute trademark of hyena scavenging. But eventually, the hyena realizes this particular bone is a dud. The marrow is simply not coming out. It is a complete waste of caloric energy. So, the hyena rage quits. It spits the mangled, slobber-covered femur onto the cave floor, probably lets out a frustrated yelp, and waddles off into the darkness to go bully a badger or scavenge a reindeer carcass. Fast forward 43 millennia. Modern humans walk into the cave. We brush the dirt off this exact bone. We entirely ignore the massive gnaw marks on the ends. We ignore the fact that the spacing of the holes perfectly matches the dental arch of a Pleistocene cave hyena. We look at a prehistoric predator's literal discarded chew toy, and we look at each other with tears in our eyes and say, "My God, it's a C major scale." It is a level of delusional brand engagement that borders on the pathological. We wanted to see high art so badly that we completely erased the hyena from its own narrative. We took an apex predator's garbage, put it behind bulletproof glass, and hailed it as a triumph of the hominid spirit. Anthropologists spent years arguing over whether the Neanderthals understood diatonic scales. They debated the acoustic resonance of the bone cavity. They brought in professional flautists to blow into a hole created by the blunt force trauma of a scavenger's tooth, attempting to reverse engineer a musical theory that never existed. They were literally trying to extract a symphony from a bite mark. Imagine if, 40,000 years from now, A team of alien archaeologists digs up a plastic, squeaky toy shaped like a hot dog, extensively chewed by a golden retriever. Imagine they then publish a dozen peer-reviewed papers claiming it was a rudimentary human communication device used to speak with the gods. That is exactly what happened with the Divje babe flute. We didn't discover the origins of jazz. We discovered our own desperate need to project genius onto a pile of literal animal trash. The cold, hard, taphonomic data is what finally closed the doors on the Neanderthal Jazz Club forever. When you actually put the Divje babe bone under a high-resolution microscope, the forensic evidence is just embarrassingly conclusive, dismantling our entire prehistoric PR campaign piece by piece. Those perfectly circular, supposedly deliberate fingerholes? They aren't the result of careful, calculated craftsmanship. If a Neanderthal had actually made this instrument, we would see microstriations. Tiny, parallel scratch marks left behind by a sharp flint blade painstakingly gouging and twisting out the bone. But there are zero tool marks. None. Instead, the edges of the holes are pushed inward, crushed and fractured by sudden, immense pressure. It is the exact biomechanical signature of a blunt, bone-crushing tooth violently slamming through the cortical wall. And if you flip the bone over, the acoustic illusion completely falls apart. On the reverse side, there is massive, chaotic damage where the lower jaw of the hyena clamped down to create leverage. This counterbite completely ruins the structural integrity required for any kind of actual wind instrument, letting air leak out everywhere. It's the acoustic equivalent of trying to play a saxophone that has been run over by a forklift. Furthermore, the crime scene itself points entirely away from a hominid drum circle. The sediment layers at Divje babe are practically devoid of the usual artifacts you'd expect from a thriving Neanderthal settlement. There are no advanced tool caches or sophisticated fire pits indicating long-term domestic life. Instead, the cave is absolutely packed with thousands of shattered cave bear bones, most of them heavily gnawed, alongside massive, undeniable piles of fossilized hyena droppings. Yes, coprolites. The cave wasn't a prehistoric recording studio or a bohemian artist's retreat. It was a hyena dining room. It was a filthy, bone-littered fast food joint where giant scavengers dragged their miserable, stolen takeout to eat in peace away from the freezing rain. The irony here is thick enough to choke a woolly rhino. We spent decades hyping up our evolutionary cousins as misunderstood prodigies, desperate to prove that early hominids possessed the refined, abstract thought necessary to compose a melody. We wanted a hero's narrative so badly. Instead, the taphonomic data accidentally proved that modern humanity is just incredibly good at running a historical scam. We literally committed post-mortem identity theft on a hyena. We looked at a frustrated predator's absolute failure to extract a midday snack, aggressively slapped a human copyright on it, and convinced the entire academic world it was a cultural milestone. We took an animal's dental record and aggressively marketed it as a profound achievement in hominid expression. When you really step back and look at the fossil record, you realize we aren't here today because we were brave warriors or visionary artists conquering the elements. We survived the Ice Age because we were the ultimate opportunistic cowards, constantly hiding in the dark, surviving on sheer dumb luck, and happily claiming the garbage left behind by real apex predators.